Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a video about data provisioning. In this video, we're going to go ahead and see what's going on in the Global Mantix network and see what their latest needs are and how we can satisfy those needs. And then we're going to spend pretty much the majority of the video in the actual operating system satisfying those needs. We're going to go ahead and create a share. We're going to take a look at the permissions on that share, and we'll see that permissions on a shared folder are managed pretty much the same way as they are on NTFS or Active Directory objects, which we've seen in previous videos. Then I'm going to go ahead and show you how to configure caching on shared folders so that users can access them while offline. And then we're going to really get into the thick of things and take a look at something called DFS, Distributed File System. And I'll show you how to create a DFS namespace and configure DFS replication between servers. All right, so let's go ahead and get right into this. First, what do we got going on in Global Mantix right now? Well, Global Mantix has some important business data that it needs to make highly available to its users. Now, this data must be available to traveling users while they're away from the office as well. And see, this data is vital to the daily operations of the company and therefore must be located in more than one location to provide fault tolerance in the event of a file server failure. So we're going to have to take a look at not just how to make data available on this file server for users to get to, but a couple of additional issues is the users need to be able to get to a copy while they're away from the office and don't necessarily have connectivity with the file server. And then also we have to have fault tolerance because we can't have business suffering just because we have one server fail. So, as I said, we're going to go right into the operating system, and what we're going to do is we're going to share a folder which contains this important data. We'll look at the permissions available on that share. We'll make the data available to users who are away from the office. We'll create the DFS namespace, and I will tell you, the purpose behind the DFS part of things is the fault tolerance. The DFS namespace is what's going to allow us to have the data be in more than one location. And then we're going to configure DFS replication so that that information can be replicated between the different locations and always up to date. So let's go into Server 2008 now and see how this all works. Okay, well, we're going to start off by going ahead and connecting with a server called New York Member 1. This is a server that we had already set up as a file server in a previous video. So let's go ahead and connect to that server now, and then we'll see how we're going to add to what's already been done. Okay, now here we are on New York Member 1. So I'm going to first of all just click Start and select Computer and go into the C drive. And you may recall from the previous video we had our user docs folder, which we had already shared, and we had done some folder redirections so that users can access their documents folder from this share. Well, now what we want to do is go ahead and create another folder. So I'm going to right click and select New Folder. And I'm going to call this folder Important Data. Okay, so this is the important data that we're talking about. And I'm going to go into that folder, and let's just go ahead and create a new text document here, and we'll say Data 1. Okay, so it's that first document that we have in this folder. Let me go ahead and back out of here. Now, when we shared the user docs folder in the previous video, the way I had showed you to do it was by right-clicking on the folder, which I'll do up here on Important Data, and selecting Share. And when you do this, you'll see here that you have the ability to go ahead and share the folder. The administrator will be set up with permission level of being owner, which means the administrator will have full control, is what that equates to. And we also saw that we could add other groups, like before we added the everyone group. But the problem here is that you're very limited. As for instance, when I share it this way, I don't get to choose what the share name is. So let me go ahead and cancel out of here, because the name important data, that might be a good name for the folder itself, but maybe that's too long of a name for users to have to connect to. So if you want to have a simpler name, then we need to give it a different share name than important data. And if we want to do that, the way we do it is by right-clicking and going to the property sheet. Once in the property sheet, we can then click on the sharing tab. Now on the sharing tab, if I click this button right here, this is going to take me right back. Here, I'll show you. I'll click it. It takes me right back to the screen we were in before. So I'm going to cancel out of there. What I want to do is select advanced sharing, because I know a little bit more about what I'm doing. So I'm going to click advanced sharing, and I'm going to select to share this folder, at which point now I can give it a share name. So maybe I want to go ahead and just give it the name data. Okay, maybe a nice short name like that might make more sense. Also, when it comes to permissions, you'll notice down here I can click permissions. And now we get to see the actual shared permissions. And you will see that shared permissions look a lot like NTFS or Active Directory Object or even printing permissions. But one thing that is a little bit different when it comes to shared folder permissions is you don't have a whole lot to choose from, right? We still have a list of users and groups we can put up here, and we still have our specific permissions that we can allow and deny, but there's only 3 to choose from, and there's no advanced button down here to get granular with it. Okay, so right now the only options we have are read, which means just that. A user could go ahead and read the stuff that's in the shared folder. Change, which means that a user can read and write, basically. Matter of fact, we can go a step further. Change is a lot like modify with NTFS permissions. It means you can read, you can write, you can delete files and folders from within this share. And then, of course, we have the full control permissions, which is the everything. There's nothing that you cannot do on this particular folder. Now, I have to tell you something. Microsoft specifically recommends that you manage your share permissions along with managing NTFS permissions. But I will also tell you that most administrators, I won't even say most, I'll just say many administrators, choose to not follow that rule, especially administrators who have been around a while. See, back in the old days, the default was when you shared a folder, everyone had full control, just as I've set it up here. And that was pretty much okay, and the reason why is because in order for users to access files and folders within the share, they would have to also have the appropriate NTFS permissions. So in other words, somebody could connect with full control share permissions, but if they were given read-only NTFS permissions, well, they would only be able to read stuff. They wouldn't be able to change anything in any way, shape, or form. They would only be able to read because the NTFS permission locks it down. As of Windows Server 2003, Microsoft made a decision based upon security that the default setting for all new shares would be just as we saw it here when I first came into this window, which is everyone read only. The problem with that is just like you have to have the appropriate NTFS permissions to get to something, well, you also have to have the appropriate share permissions. So in other words, with the default of everyone read only, even if you were to go into a shared folder and inside that shared folder were files and folders which had NTFS permissions of full control, the user wouldn't get full control. The user would get read. And the reason why is because, again, in order to have access to stuff, in order to have access to files and folders across the network, when accessing across the network via a shared folder, you need to have the appropriate shared and NTFS permissions. So the way it actually works out is it's not that shared permissions take precedence or that NTFS permissions take precedence. It's that the more restrictive of the two will take precedence. So the shared permissions being read and the NTFS permissions being full control, you end up with read. Whereas if the share permissions are full control and the NTFS permissions are read, you still only get read. You get the more restrictive no matter where it is. Okay, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to kind of do the old school way, the non-Microsoft recommended way, and I'm going to say everyone has full control, and we'll worry about the actual control being managed through NTFS permissions. So I'm going to click OK, OK once again, and close. So now what I've just done is on our file server, I've created a folder where we can store this important data that GlobalMantics needs available to its users and shared it so that users can access it across the network. Now, to verify that users can indeed access this data across the network, what I'm going to do is go ahead and I'm going to minimize New York Member 1 for just a moment. And I'm going to go ahead and connect to New York Vista 1. So I'm going to connect to one of our clients and see if we can actually access the data. All right, so it's connecting and logging in here to New York Vista 1. And now that I'm connected, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click Start. And in my Start search window, I'm going to put in // New York-Mem1-2K8. That's the name of the server. / data, right? That was the name of the share that we created. And when I hit enter, you will see here that a window opens up which has the information that was in that shared folder, right? I mean, here's that data1 file that we put into that folder. So we have successfully made data available across the network to the GlobalMantics users. And the actual access to this information would be controlled via the NTFS permissions because we let everyone have full control to the share itself. So let me go ahead and close this, and I'm going to minimize New York Vista 1 for just a moment because we need to go back to New York Member 1, go back to our file server, because another thing that we have to do is we have to make it that users can access this data when not connected to the network. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click on this folder and go to Properties. And then I'm going to go to the Sharing tab and go to Advanced Sharing once again. Because one of the other things that we can do in Advanced Sharing, which I didn't show you a few moments ago, right? I showed you how to set up the share name and I showed you how to do permissions, but there's this extra button here which says Caching. When we click on the Caching button, this is what allows us to determine whether we're going to allow users to keep a locally cached copy of the information contained within this shared folder. Now we have a few different choices here. The first one, and this is the default setting by the way, is it says only the files and programs that users specify will be available offline. Okay, this is what's also known as manual caching. By default, caching is enabled. We do allow users to keep a cached copy, but it needs to be done manually, meaning users will only be able to keep the stuff that they specifically say that they want to have cached. Now, another option would be to have all files and programs that the users open from the share automatically available offline. That means pretty much everything the user touches, boom, they're going to get a cached copy. And I'll tell you what, for this particular scenario, that's probably how we would want to have this setting, because we don't want users to necessarily have to remember to pick files that they want to have available locally. We want them just to have it. So that might be the way that we would do the setting for the GlobalMantics scenario. Now the last choice would be files and programs are not available offline. This is if we want to disable caching and say that no, users cannot have a locally cached copy. The only copy that we're going to have out there is the one that's here on this server. Now, what I'm going to select is the top one. Even though it's the second one, the automatic caching that I said would probably be the best for our scenario, I want to show you how the manual caching works as well. So I'm going to go ahead and set up manual caching, which is the default. I always fall for that, where the advanced sharing window is right inside of the properties window. So I click OK down here. You got to click this OK and then close. All right, now the reason I did that is, again, I want to show you how manual caching works. And to do this, let's go over to a client. So let's minimize New York Member 1, go back to New York Vista 1. I'm going to go ahead and connect to that share once again. So double / New York -mem 1 -2k8 / data. And then what I need to do is select the specific file that I want to have a locally cached copy. I would right click on that file and then select always available offline. That's how I manually on the client side select that this is a document that I want to have a locally cached copy. And once I do that, I will be able to access this file even if New York Member 1 is not available to me. So if I was a laptop traveling user and I'm out, let's say, up on an airplane and I don't have access to the internet, or I don't have access to remotely connect back into the office, I would be able to go ahead and open and manage this document just the same way I would if I was connected to the office. Now, one thing I need to caution you about, and that is if you're going to use caching, if you're going to use offline files this way, since this is data that's really out there for many users to utilize, this form of caching was not really designed for multi-user connectivity. In other words, if everybody, or let's say a dozen people, were to take a copy of this on their own local machine and go away from the office and then open it up and then make some changes to it, well, what's going to happen is when they come back to the office and they connect back into the company network and connect back to New York Member 1, it's going to attempt to resynchronize this file with the file on the server, and it's going to recognize, as different people come back with their different changes, that the file on the server is not the one that they originally took, and so therefore their changes are going to most likely alter someone else's changes, etc., etc. So typically in this type of a scenario, you would probably want to make sure that the data was read-only, so everybody can have a readable copy, but that changes can only be made while connected to the server. And that gets to be a bit of a challenge because there are no specific permissions related to the offline status. So that's the kind of thing where it can get a little complicated. Typically, caching would be something that would be used. Actually, I'll show you where caching would typically be used. Let me go ahead and close this and minimize New York Vista 1. Go back to New York Member 1. Down here, the user docs folder. That would be a perfect example of where offline files would be used and where caching would be used, because now users have their own individual stuff and really they're the only ones that are going to access the files. So if they take a locally cached copy and they make changes to that locally cached copy, well, that's okay because no one else is also making changes somewhere else. Okay, so now we have satisfied the situation of having data that's available to users across the network. We've made it that that data can be cached locally and used while not connected to the network. The one last thing we need to do is we need to make it that we have a certain degree of fault tolerance built into this so that we can go ahead and not have to worry about one server going down. Now, I will tell you before we go into DFS, there is one form of fault tolerance which is called a failover cluster. And that is something we're going to get into later on in this course. But I'll tell you what, to go through the effort of establishing a failover cluster just so that you can have one folder have a level of fault tolerance, it's not worth all the effort. And so that's a big part of what DFS is going to do for us. It's going to allow us to have something similar to a failover cluster, but without having to go through nearly the level of effort and configuration. So, what do we need to do to set up our DFS environment? Well, the first thing we have to do is we have to install the role. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Start and go to Server Manager because that's where we add roles, right? Now, once we're in the Server Manager, we want to go ahead and expand our roles because you will see here that the File Services role is already installed. I'm going to click on File Services, and the reason that it's already installed is because in the last video we went ahead and installed it for the File Server Resource Manager aspect of things so that we could do disk quotas on individual folders. Well, let me go ahead and scroll this down, and you will see here that again we have the File Server role, and then we have the Role Service File Server Resource Manager also installed. But DFS, Distributed File System, is not. The way we add that is by clicking this button right here that says Add Role Service. So it's a little bit different than the actual adding of a role. The role is already there. DFS is actually a role service within the File Server role. And if we had not installed the File Server role, we would have to add that role and then include the service with it. So I'm going to click Add Role Service. And then you'll see here again the File Server Resource Manager is already installed. So I'm going to check the box for Distributed File System. And then there are two sub boxes. There's the namespaces and replication. And we want to do both. We're going to set up a namespace and we're going to configure replication. So I'm going to click Next. And the first thing it's going to ask me about is, do I want to create a namespace now? And well, yes, I do. I mean, DFS is kind of pointless without a namespace. Now, I could do it later. I could say, no, don't worry about it. Just install the role or the role service, and then I'll go in and do it later. But no real reason to do that. We want to create a namespace right now. The namespace is how the share that we created will now be recognized within DFS. Now, this will make a lot more sense as it all comes together. But for right now, let's give it a name. And the name I'm going to give it is just important. So we're creating a namespace and we're giving it the name important. And I'm going to click Next. And now I get to choose whether I want it to be a domain-based namespace or a standalone namespace. The difference is you use a domain-based namespace to go ahead and, it says right here, you'll notice you'll store it on one or more namespace servers within the Active Directory domain. And if it wasn't obvious from what I just said, you can only use this if you're working in an Active Directory environment, which we are. We are working within the Global Mantics domain here. So we can go ahead and create multiple namespace servers, which is something that we're going to want to do because we want to have fault tolerance, by using the domain-based namespace. The standalone namespace would be for a single server. Okay, so everything would be just hosted on one server. And if you take a look down here in the gray boxes, you'll notice for the domain-based namespace, the new share is going to be recognized by connecting via the domain name, not via a server name. So now users don't have to remember New York member 1. They only have to remember the name of their domain, Global Mantics. On a standalone namespace, you would still be connecting via the server. And there are advantages to the standalone namespace. One of them being, if you wanted to actually go a step further and create a failover cluster of the DFS server, then you would do it with a standalone namespace because you can't do it on a domain-based namespace. Also with a standalone namespace, although there's only one namespace server, you could go ahead and have the data be stored in different places. Now we're going to see all of this in just a few moments, but we're going to go ahead and select domain-based namespace. This checkbox right here, Enable Windows Server 2008 mode, basically is just a factor of saying, look, are all of our servers Windows Server 2008? If they are, let's go ahead and enable a mode which allows for increased scalability and access-based enumeration. In other words, things work more efficiently. But we can only do that if we have all Windows Server 2008 computers because obviously the older versions wouldn't understand the newer technology. So we have everything selected the way it should be. I'm going to click Next. Now I need to actually configure the namespace. And the first step in configuring the namespace is to go ahead and add what's called a folder target. In other words, it's here that we're going to point to one of our shared folders. So I'm going to click Add. And where it says Select a folder target, I'm going to browse to one. And for New York Member 1, that's the server that the share is on, I'm going to click Show Shared Folders. And here you'll see the data share. So we'll make sure it's highlighted and click OK. And now what we've done is we have essentially created a pointer to the shared folder called data. Well, it's actually called important data, but the share name is data. And then we need to give it, again, pretty much a DFS share name. And I think data is still a good name, so we're just going to leave that alone. But we could change it to something else. And you'll notice here that the folder location, the way users would access it, is by going to double/globalmantics.com/important/data. Now, I'll get to showing you how we connect in just a few minutes. So I'm going to click OK. And now we have pointed to our first shared folder within this DFS infrastructure. And that is the folder that we want to point to because that's the folder with the important data that we want to have highly available with fault tolerance. All right, let me go ahead and click Next. And you'll see here that there's a confirmation screen and install. Now this will take just a few moments to install the role service. And while it is, let me explain one other significant use for DFS. We're not going to necessarily do it here right now, but one of the other common uses for DFS besides establishing fault tolerance the way we are here is to go ahead and make data highly available to users that are in different locations within the organization. Okay, so you might have users in one city and users in another city, and they both need access to the same data. Well, rather than having the data in one location and having users from the other location have to go across the slow WAN link to get to that data, what you can do is with DFS, you can put the data in both locations. And then each of the users would go ahead and connect to their own server, the server in their own location, which they can get to quickly and easily. And then as long as we set up replication, well, the data will stay consistent between the folders. So anyway, like I said, that's just another really common scenario where DFS is used, as well as just trying to establish fault tolerance as we're doing in this scenario. All right, well, this is going to be just another few moments before the installation is complete. So I'm going to pause the video, and I'll be right back with you as soon as it's complete. Okay, well, the file services, and more specifically, distributed file system role has been installed, and it succeeded. Have our green circle with the check mark. So let's go ahead and click Close. And we can even close out of the Server Manager, because now I'm going to take you into the actual DFS management. So I'm going to click Start, Administrative Tools, DFS Management. In DFS Management, the first thing that I want to take a look at is right here. It says Namespaces. So I'm going to expand that. And it takes just a moment while it looks to see what namespaces it might be managing. I'm going to actually click this little button here to close the Action menu. Give us a little more room to work with. I'm going to expand this bar over just a little bit. There we go. Because I want you to see that we have the namespace globalmantics.com important. And if I expand that, you'll see here that we have a folder target for data. Or really, I shouldn't even call it a folder target. We have a folder called data, and the folder target is the actual location of the share. That's significant because we're going to see how to add additional folder targets in just a moment. Okay, because right now, all we've really done is given this share that we already had, well, we've given it a new name, or we've given a new way to access that data. Okay, and to show you this, let's go back to our client and see how this works. I'm going to go ahead and minimize this and go back to New York Vista 1. Now previously I clicked start and I put in double backslash and I put in New York member 1 -2K8 backslash data. Well, now I'm going to make it that the user doesn't have to know what server it's on. The user just knows that within the GlobalMantics domain, and we don't even need the .com, we can just put in double backslash GlobalMantics backslash important. Okay, that's the name of the DFS share that we created. So if a user can remember nothing more than just the name of their domain and that one share name, important, I'm going to hit enter. You'll see here that it takes me into a DFS share, and in that share, there's a folder called data. If I double click on data, you'll see there's the data1 file that we had. If I right click, new, another text document, call this one data2, and then go ahead and minimize New York Vista 1, go back to New York Member 1. On New York Member 1, let's go back to our local C drive and go into that important data folder. You'll see that both data 1 and data 2 are there. In other words, we've now created another way to access this particular shared folder. And I will tell you, let me go back to DFS management. I could, at this point, right click and create another new folder. Matter of fact, I'm going to do this just to show you, but then we're going to delete it. I could add another new folder and click add, browse. And remember, we also had this user docs share. So I'm going to click OK. We have that user docs share. Click OK once again. Have to give it a name. Well, how about just docs? Just to give it a different name than the original user docs share. Click OK. You'll see that now we have this docs share in the DFS share as well. I'm going to click to minimize this. Go back to Vista. And let's go ahead and close this. Once again, put in double backslash GlobalMantics backslash important. And notice now from that one share, I didn't have to know what server it was on. From that one share, I now have two different shared folders that I can get to. And I don't need to know where these shared folders exist. They could exist on any server within the domain. And if I click on the data share, it takes me into that data share. If I click on the doc share, it takes me into that user doc share where we had A. Fry and A. Lewis who had logged in and created their own user documents. So that's just to show you how that works. And let me go ahead and go back to New York Member 1. And let's just go ahead and remove this docs folder. We don't need that. Let me go ahead and delete. Now you'll notice it says this operation will delete the selected folder from the namespace. Also, child folders would be deleted from the namespace, but it does not delete the actual shared folder. Okay, I'm not deleting any data here. I'm just taking it out of DFS management. So I'm going to click yes, and we're back to the data share. All right, now we need to implement the fault tolerance aspect of things. And in order to do that, we need another server to act as an additional file server. So I'm going to minimize New York Member 1, and the server we're going to use is New York DC1. Now, this probably wouldn't be that common in the real world. You wouldn't necessarily use your domain controller as a file server, but you might if you had a smaller organization. In this case, I'm going to use it just to show you that you can, because one of the significant pieces to understand about the namespace server aspect of DFS is that it must be a domain controller or a member server within the domain. And in this case, we're going to go to the domain controller. So let me click Start, Computer, and go to the local disk. Let's go ahead and create a new folder, and we'll call it Important Data. Right? That's the same name that we had on the other file server, and that's the idea here. We want to have two copies of the same data. And we don't have to give it the exact same name, but we're going to. Then I'm going to go ahead and right click and go to Properties, go to the Sharing tab, click Advanced Sharing, share the folder. We'll give it the share name data, just to keep it simple. We'll make sure the permissions are everyone full control. Click OK. Click OK and close. So basically what I've done is exactly the same thing that we did over on New York Member 1. And the reason why, let me go ahead and minimize this and then go back to New York Member 1, is that now we're going to create an additional folder target on the same share. So I'm going to right click on data and add a folder target. I'm going to browse. And in this case, instead of looking at New York Member 1, let's browse and put in New York-DC, which should take us to New York DC 1. And now we see the data share on New York DC 1. Click OK and OK. Now, even though I have added the additional target, in other words, this one folder within the DFS share is pointing to two different locations, in order to keep them synchronized, we must have what's called a replication group. So I'm going to click yes. I do want to create a replication group. If I don't, I'm looking for trouble. So I'm going to click yes. And it'll take just a moment here while it looks at how things are currently set up. And then we can go forward and set up this replication group. And I'll tell you what, setting up the replication group is mostly an issue of clicking next a bunch of times. Okay, here it's just saying, what folder do you want to create this replication on? And we want the data folder to be replicated. We're going to go ahead and give the replication group the name globalmantics.com/important/data. That all makes sense. No reason to ever change that. So I'm going to click next. Here is where we get to choose which folder targets are going to go ahead and replicate with one another. And you'll see that I only have the two, and they're going to be added as a DFS replication member. So I'll click next again. Now this screen requires you to enter something. Notice the next button is grayed out. So this is the one screen that you have to do something. You have to pick a primary member. And the primary member really only matters during the initial replication. In other words, right now, matter of fact, let me show you this. Right now, if we go down here to the important data folder, I have two data files on New York Member 1, right? If I minimize this and go to New York DC 1, you'll notice that this folder's empty. So what that means is, let me go ahead and minimize this and go back to New York Member 1. I need to pick which way we want to replicate. If I pick New York DC 1 as my primary, well then the two files that are on New York Member 1, they might disappear. Because we're saying that New York DC 1, which is empty, is going to push to New York Member 1. In this case, I'm going to select New York Member 1 as my primary, meaning those two files need to be synchronized over to New York DC 1. Now after this, I'm going to go ahead and click Next. And we do have an option here, although there's nothing we're going to change for right now. We have the choice of setting up what's called a replication topology. How do we want the servers to replicate with one another? Well, in the case of only two, we're going to use full mesh, meaning everybody replicates with everybody else because there's only two. If there were more than two, then we would have to decide, do we want to have in this example they're showing you 4, do we want everybody to be replicating with everybody else? Or to try to make bandwidth more efficiently used, we may want to use hub and spoke, which is where we have one who's going to go ahead and replicate with each of the others. So in other words, one change might be made on this particular server. It would be replicated to the hub, who would then replicate it out to the others. This is a very, very common replication topology when you have a central location and a lot of remote locations all connecting to the centralized location. In this instance, nothing to worry about. There's only two, so we're going to go ahead and use full mesh and click Next. Now we need to create a schedule and bandwidth. Well, basically, we can do what's called bandwidth throttling. By default, it will use the full bandwidth to do replication, and I'll tell you what, for the most part, this would probably be what would be used in most scenarios because we're not talking about large quantities of data, although there could be scenarios where there are large quantities of data, and you may not have a WAN link that is equipped to handle the replication and the other WAN connectivity needs. So then you could go ahead and you can limit how much of that connectivity is being used by DFS. You also have the ability to set up a schedule if you want to make it that only certain days and times we replicate between the two folders. Now in this instance, and in many real-world instances, you leave it with the default to replicate continuously, meaning a change is made in one place, essentially immediately replicate to the other. And then again, full bandwidth unless we have specific throttling needs. So let's go ahead and leave the default and select Next. Here's a review screen and click Create. And this does not take a long time. As you see, it went through very quickly. Got a bunch of green circles with check marks, and that's what we want to see. A lot of successes here. And click Close. Now, you get a little mention here about the fact that there is a delay in the initial replication. If I click OK to this message, what that's pretty much telling me is that there are other factors involved, which makes it that the information that's presently on New York Member 1 may not get to New York DC 1 instantaneously. Matter of fact, in my experience, it typically is not instantaneously. It's typically 5 to 15 minute wait period before that replication takes place. And part of the reason why is because this is really integrating itself in with Active Directory replication, in which you have different factors that can control this. And I will tell you, if we had our servers in different physical locations, which may be set up as different sites, and those sites might have a replication schedule, well, that initial replication might take, a day if that's how the site replication schedule is set up. Now, just to see if this is actually working, let me go ahead and minimize New York Member 1, and let's go to New York DC 1, and go to our computer, C drive, and important data, and you'll notice that this folder is still empty. And again, that's not really a surprise. That is what I typically have seen. There is a delay there. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and pause the video, and then I'm going to come back with you after, 5, 10, 15 minutes has gone by and we have successfully replicated. Okay. On my machine, that actually only took probably, it seemed like it was only about 2 or 3 minutes. And as you can see here, we're still on New York DC 1. And now the Data 1 and Data 2 files do exist. Matter of fact, let me back out a step so you can see here. We're in the important data folder, Data 1, Data 2. If I minimize this, go back to New York Member 1, and go to its important data folder, we see the same thing. If I minimize this, go back to New York Vista 1, click Start, enter in the Start search window our / Globomantics. And actually, I'll tell you what, this whole entering of Globomantics / important is getting to be kind of a nuisance. So let me show you something else you can do for your users. What I'm going to do instead of this is I'm going to right click on Computer, and I'm going to select Map Network Drive. What this does is this gives me the ability to assign a drive letter to a share. So typically, most people know this is pointing to a share on a specific server, but you can do this to point to a DFS share as well. So I'm going to go ahead and, how about we make it the I drive, right, for important. And then for the folder, this is where I'll put in the / Globomantics / important folder. I can tell it to reconnect at logon, meaning every time I log in, try to go ahead and reestablish that I drive, and click Finish. And you'll see here, let me go ahead and, it opens the folder. Let me go ahead and close this. Now all I have to do is click Start, Computer, and then here's our I drive. So I'm going to double click I, and then there's our data folder. And if I go in there, there we have Data 1 and Data 2. So what we've seen is we have the same information on both New York DC1 and New York Member 1, and when we access it, we can see it on New York Vista 1. Now on New York Vista 1, I'm going to right click, New, Text Document, and we're going to create Data Document number 3. And the reason I did this is because I want to show you that if I minimize this, go back to New York Member 1, boom, it's already there. If I minimize this, go to New York DC1, boom, it's already there. Only the initial replication really takes time. After that, if you have set up a replication schedule of always and using full bandwidth, you'll see that this will happen quite quickly. Now, obviously, the larger that this document might be, the longer it might take to replicate to 2 different servers or 3 different servers, and that's a whole nother issue. If the folder targets, maybe you have a dozen different folder targets, it might take a little while to get to all the different folder targets, but it happens pretty close to instantaneously. And you'll notice that when we were back on New York Vista 1, I don't even know which server I was connecting to. I don't know if I connected to New York DC 1, which then had to replicate to New York Member 1, or maybe I was connected to New York Member 1, which replicated to New York DC 1. I don't care. That's the whole point of this. You want it to be transparent to the user. They don't need to worry about it. You manage this as a network administrator. Now, there is one other issue that we need to take into consideration, and that is an issue of fault tolerance. So let me go ahead and go back to New York Member 1, and let's go back into DFS management. Right now, if one of these 2 servers were to go down, that would be okay. The user would still be able to get to the data on the other server. That's the way it's all designed. And when that server that was down came back online, it would get a replica of any changes that were made since it went down. The problem that we have is that in this instance, if New York Member 1 were to go down, that's the server I'm on right now, the user would lose access to the data, and the reason why is because although the data itself is in 2 different locations, the DFS share is being managed. This DFS namespace, I really should say, is being managed only on New York Member 1. See, if I go to namespace servers, you'll see there's just the 1 server. So what we need to do is build in an extra level of fault tolerance on the DFS server side as well. And I will tell you, this is a piece that a lot of people don't think of. Very often, the way it will be set up, and I've seen this, the way it'll be set up is you'll have a DFS server, and that's its purpose in life, meaning it doesn't even contain one of the shared folders. The DFS server just points to a bunch of folder targets that are on other servers around the network. And if any of those servers fail, well, we've got fault tolerance built in. But the one thing that the administrator hasn't taken into consideration is that if the DFS server itself goes down, you're out of luck. The user doesn't have access to the DFS share at all, and you better hope that your users know about the name of one of the servers that has the shared information. And to go a step further, if the user was to make a change in one of the folders, or let's say you had users all around the network making changes in different folders, and then DFS came back, you've got a big mess on your hands. So, there's 2 different ways to build in fault tolerance to your DFS server. One way would be if we had a standalone namespace. We could take the DFS server itself and make it part of a failover cluster, which again is something we'll get into later on in this course, so you'll have a full understanding of that. And then what you're doing is you're kind of protecting the server through that cluster. But to use a simpler technique, we can do it right here through DFS by adding an additional namespace server. And we do that by right-clicking on the namespace and adding a namespace server. And this can be any other server within the domain. So I'm going to click Browse, and I'm going to put in New York-DC, which should take us to New York DC1. I'll click OK, and OK. And you'll see here it's going to take just a moment while it checks everything out to make sure that this is going to work. And it's very interesting that it does this, because what's going to happen is well, what should happen is everything is going to say that it's okay. But believe it or not, there's still one more step we have to do after this before everything will truly work. So as you can see here, it successfully went through, and now both New York Member 1 and New York DC 1 are namespace servers for the Global Mantics / important namespace. Now I said there's one more thing we have to do, so let's do that now. We need to go over to New York DC 1. I'm going to actually go ahead and close this window. We don't need that anymore. The problem is although this has been established as a namespace server to manage this area of namespace, well, we don't have the DFS file services role installed. So I need to do that. I'm going to click Start and go to Server Manager. And everything I'm going to do here is going to be just like how we did it on New York Member 1. I'm going to follow the exact same steps. I'm going to go ahead and expand roles. And this might take just a few moments. It has to gather information, and there's already stuff happening on this server, right? As you can see, we're Active Directory, we're DHCP, DNS. We even have the file services role generically installed already, even Windows deployment services. There's a lot of stuff going on in this machine, but that's okay. I'm going to click on the file services role, and it'll take just a moment, but then it's going to come up, and you'll see that we need to add the DFS service role. And there we go. We go ahead and scroll down. And again, you'll see here under Role Services, we have the generic file server role installed, but none of the actual role services. So I'm going to click on Add Role Service, select DFS, and click Next. And this is where I lied. I said that we were going to do everything exactly the way we did it on New York Member 1. Well, I lied. There is one thing that will be different, and it's right here. Instead of creating a namespace, we already have a namespace. So I'm going to click the button that says create a namespace later. We don't want to create another one. We already have it. If I say create another one and try to give it the same name, I should get an error saying that that name already exists. So I'm going to say create it later and click next. And there's nothing else to do now, so we'll just click install. And it's going to install this DFS role service to the file services role. This will take a few moments, so I'm going to go ahead and pause the video, and I'll be right back with you as soon as it's complete. Alright, the role service has been installed, so I'm going to go ahead and click close. And we'll go ahead and close out of Server Manager. And just like we did on New York Member 1, we're going to go into the DFS Management by clicking Start, Administrative Tools, DFS Management. And what should happen now, well, let me go ahead and let's get rid of the Actions pane. And what should happen now is you'll notice under Namespaces, there's nothing there. What we want to do, oh, it did it for us. Beat us to the punch. Because this was already set up as a namespace server, it went ahead and populated this for us. But let me show you what you would do if that didn't happen so quickly. You would right click and you would add a namespace to display. And you'd click on that and then you would select it. Now again, I didn't have to. Things are working very nicely and it went ahead and populated for us. If I expand that, you'll notice that the data folder is already there, and if I click on it, you'll see the two folder targets are already there. If I expand replication, you'll see here that the Global Mantics important data replication is already in place. And I'll also show you that if you click on the Connections tab right here, here's where you'll see the specific connections, and this is where you can also force replication by right-clicking and saying Replicate Now. But one little side note I will tell you, that will not necessarily help you with that initial replication that we had to wait on. I've tried it many times. I've tried to force it and said, come on, replicate. That initial replication, you still have to wait. This would be if for some reason you had a schedule in place and you wanted to force it to go sooner than the original schedule. Another thing I also want to show you before we go any further is this domain system volume replication. And the reason I wanted to show you that it's there is because, and there's really nothing here to look at when it comes to members. It's other than I just want to point out that DFS is something that is being used by our domain controllers, regardless of if we choose to use it elsewhere. That's part of why the file services role is kind of already there on a domain controller. Once you install it, you can't remove it. And the reason why is because even though it's invisible to us if we don't install the file server role, once it's installed, the operating system is going to say, you know, this was kind of there all along. And DFS replication is what's being used for our Active Directory replication. So nothing really to show you here other than just mentioning that it is in place already for Active Directory, and it uses the exact same services that we're using for this entire demonstration. Okay, so now that we have everything in place on New York DC1, along with the things that we have in place on New York Member 1, let's go ahead and go back to New York Member 1 and let's take it down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click Start and Shut Down. And we have to give it a reason because we have the Shutdown Event Tracker. This is something that is kind of nice to have because you can have a reason to have a logged entry as to why we're shutting it down. I'm just going to put a generic comment in there. I'll click OK. It's giving me a warning here because it's a remote computer, right? I'm in remote desktop here. So I'll click yes, I know I'm about to kick myself off by doing that. But anyway, that shutdown tracker is also something you can disable if you feel it's just getting in the way. All right, well, we've now shut down New York Member 1. It's gone. And what I want to show you is I want to show you that if I go over to, well, first of all, I'm going to go, just for the fun of it, over to New York DC1 and put in our double backslash global mantics backslash important. You notice that it's still there. Okay, meaning even though New York Member 1 is down, I can still get to all the information on New York DC1. Well, duh, I'm on New York DC1. Of course I can get there. Also in DFS management, you'll notice that I still can get to everything and I can still manage everything from within DFS management. Okay, whoop-de-doo, I know you're not satisfied with that. So let's do the real thing that we need to do, and that is let's minimize New York DC1, go back to New York Vista 1, right? That's the part that matters. Our client matters. Let me close that window because I don't want you to think, well, you were already there and it's just still there. No, I closed the window. Let's go back to it. I'm going to click Start in Computer, and you'll notice that it shows that the iDrive is still connected. Let me double click on it. And although there may be a slight delay because what it's doing right now is it's saying, wait a minute, maybe I connected to New York Member 1 the first time and he's not there. What it's doing is it's renegotiating, and now we've connected to that same share. And we go to data, the data's still there. I can even go in here and create another new text document. We'll call this one data file 4, right? Here we have data 4. If I minimize New York Vista 1 and go back to New York DC 1 and go to the data folder, you'll notice data 4 is there. Now, the only other thing that I want to show you is I want to bring New York Member 1 back online. So let me hit the button here. All right, you can't see it because I'm not connected to it, obviously, but I'm booting up New York Member 1 as we speak. And as soon as that computer is back up and running, we're going to go ahead and connect to it and see that everything gets replicated from New York DC1. In other words, that new 4th file that we just created, well, it will appear on New York Member 1. Now, here is the actual New York Member 1 server. You'll notice we're just looking at a blank screen because it is logging in, or I should say booting up right now. There we go, applying computer settings. This will take just a moment to go ahead and boot back up, and once it's up, we'll go ahead and log in and see that everything's there. Oh, well, here's our Control-Alt-Delete to log on window. I'm not going to log on here. I'm going to go back and do remote desktop, so let me connect back to our other computer. Okay, let's do our remote desktop connection to New York Member 1. And here we are now logging in. And there's a couple things that I want to do now. First thing that I want to do is click Start, Computer, C drive, go into my important data folder, and notice all 4 data files are there. So replication did work. The second thing I would do is click on Start, Administrative Tools, DFS Management, and just basically verify that I still have the ability to manage the Global Mantics / important namespace, right? And there it is. And there's data, replication. There's our Global Mantics important / data replication group. By the way, you'll notice that there's only one here because this is a member server. So that domain Active Directory replication group is not there. All right, well, that is pretty much how DFS works. And it looks like we have satisfied the Global Mantics scenario requirements, right? We went ahead and we created a folder and we made it available to the users. We made that folder available offline, and well, now we established fault tolerance and proved it by taking one of our servers down. Well, not only have we satisfied the Global Mantics scenario, but we've also come to the end of this video. And at this point, you should now know how to share a folder, set its permissions, and remember, it's not that uncommon at all to just go ahead and say everyone full control, even though the default permission is everyone read only. You should know how to make that shared folder available, or at least the data inside that shared folder, available to users who are not connected to the network. And remember that by default, this is enabled with what's called manual caching, meaning users would have to manually say, I want this available offline. But you can also set it up for automatic caching, or you can disable the caching. You should know how to create a DFS namespace to simplify the process of accessing shares to your users, and then also be able to go ahead and create a level of fault tolerance, or it is a real common term, and we used it here, called making things highly available by having a duplicate copy of the information, and go ahead and set up replication not only of the information itself, but of the actual namespace servers themselves to have complete fault tolerance built into our DFS environment. All right, well, that's it. I'll see you in the next video.